I'll just quickly run through, I'll skim through this. So these are the most clear, I'll just very quickly say those are the 10 most cleared bioregions. I guess it probably won't be a surprise to many people here that they're on flat, fertile, low elevation country. So good farming basically, which is why they've been cleared. They tend to be large because they don't have much in way of hills, which is tends to divide up bioregions. They're large and flat bioregions. They have poor conservation reserve system representation, have average around 5% compared to a statewide average of 16% of the original extent of native vegetation. Poor site condition, poor landscape context as well. So site condition, just quickly, is about, it's a modelled layer based on 17,000 ground truth points fed into a model to model the occurrence of things such as weediness, recruitment of saplings and other native vegetation, amount of fallen timber, extent of large trees, hollow-bearing trees, those sorts of things. So they've got about 10 parameters that against which we measure site condition. And landscape context is a measure of how structurally connected the vegetation is, so how large patches are. Places with good landscape context will have large patches, lots of native vegetation in the landscape, generally well connected. Places with poor landscape context will have not much native vegetation, mostly in small patches, mostly not connected, for example. One of the key things about that we found, probably again no surprise, but good to have it confirmed, is that the amazing domination of small patches, statewide even. So what this graph is saying is that in terms of the total area, this is patch size, and this is percent of the total extent. So these are small patches, 0 to 1 hectare. These are large patches, 1,000 hectares plus. In terms of area, about 80% of the remnant native vegetation in fragmented landscapes in Victoria is in a patch greater than 1,000 hectares. But in terms of number, over nearly 90% are in patches less than a hectare. So lots of tiny little patches out there. 2 million of them, 2.7 million in total, and 2 million smaller than a hectare, but contributing and making a tiny contribution to the actual area. There's an important implication, of course, again, if you're looking to intervene to look after the biodiversity in that part of the world. The moderately cleared bioregions, there's 11 of those, and they essentially are between that low elevation, flat, fertile country at the most cleared and the largely intact landscape. So they're in foothill country, typically, and sometimes some of the mallee country. In the report, we go through each of the 28 bioregions one by one of a double-page spread, giving basic stats. This is, again, the Victorian River Ram that we were looking at a minute ago, showing that about 80% of the native vegetation has been cleared in that bioregion. Of the 20% that remains, about 3/4 is on public land, is on private land rather, and of the quarter that's on public land, most is outside the conservation reserve system. And most of the problem there is not the conventional political problem that people don't like national parks or whatever, there's opposition when they try and create national parks. Most of the problem is that they're in roadsides. When they're not in roadsides, they're in stream sides and so on, so they're not good spots to go and make conservation reserves. So it's not a problem that can be overcome with political will in that kind of sense. It's a much more insidious problem than that to address the protected area status. And then for each bioregion, we have a graph of the spread of site condition scores. They go from 0 to 80, so these are high quality sites. You can see most you can see this distribution is kind of truncated. Most bioregions have a kind of more normalised distribution, so it's got lots of poor to medium condition sites. That's private land is the pale green, public land is the dark green. But you can look at the map in some of the bioregions and sort of identify these peaks and troughs. You actually see the patch where that is. Sometimes if it's a big swamp or something, you can see a little peak and say, oh, that's there. This is the landscape context score, so how well connected they are. They go from 0 to 20, and you can see again, there is some reasonable landscape context in this part of the world, largely because of those roadsides. And these areas here on private land are in that in those northern plains grasslands I was talking about west of Echuca, so you can identify these areas on the maps. So that brings us to the key themes or future directions that we're talking about that we flagged. Got 19 things. They've kind of emerged from the data, from information people have given us, some submissions, some just work with decision theory we've done, and some kind of consensus in the scientific community, if you like. So I've kind of arranged them in groups here in a slightly different order in the report, but things like preventing further loss, that seems to be the most kind of obvious no-brainer, that it's expensive and risky and no guarantees of success to revegetate. So if you can save what you've got, even if you're only losing 4,500 hectares a year in Victoria, it's still a lot easier to stop that happening than it is to put 4,500 hectares back 3,000 hectares of its native grassland. When approximately, as I was saying, most of the loss of biodiversity that is happening is kind of insidious kind of loss of site condition across the landscape. So when if that's where most of the loss is occurring, that's where most of your actions to do something about it should be. So it's just kind of common sense, really. Maximising likely effectiveness, that sort of sounds like a motherhood statement, but it's actually a kind of statement of making a considered thing to not stress about uncertainty. You know, particularly in the scientific community, you can see scientists interested in interesting and difficult problems, you know, and things that they're uncertain about. You can spend a lot of time and effort sorting that out, and that's all good, and that will probably be extremely important in 10 years' time when we've resolved these difficult problems. But as a kind of bureaucrat and planner, it's better to focus on the things we do know. There's plenty that can be done that we are quite certain about, and not worry too much about the uncertainties. Obviously, fire management's a big issue in Victoria at the moment, integrating management across public and private land, and that sort of thing. I can probably just leave the rest of those up there until you can see for themselves. Thanks
very much, Paul. Has anybody got any questions that we can take? Just a couple of questions, David?
Paul, I'm David from Southern River CMA. I'm just wondering whether you've used vegetation in the sense of your work. Before I start, congratulations. No offence, but it puts us to shame a lot of what you've done. I'm just wondering whether you've used vegetation in the context of your work as a surrogate for, I think you call landscape ecology or ecosystem function. So when you go back to making your recommendations, do you then move back towards ecology and include fauna and genetics in your considerations for recommendations?
Yeah. We've done a little bit of, we've kind of dabbled in that area a bit in, well, it's kind of a short presentation. I stripped this down from an hour-long presentation. But we've done a little, kind of explored that sort of thing without knowing. But it's kind of exploring the relationship between native vegetation and biodiversity. We've done some circuit scope analysis on page 40 or thereabouts. So I don't know if you're familiar with circuit scope, but it's how it's about the relationship between structural connectivity and ecological connectivity, and how the same landscape looks different to different species, if you like. Putting it simply, with a lay audience, I normally say something like birds that migrate from Asia see a landscape or see a kilmere cleared paddock very differently to a snail that never left its rainforest habitat. You know what I mean? It's an insurmountable barrier for the snail. And the bird migrating from Asia won't even notice it. And so we've kind of explored that a little bit, that circuit scope analysis, and where species or genes will move through the landscape. So
that's a pretty large resolution picture. It's a big picture.
Yeah.
I'm thinking more in terms of the core of the question comes from the idea of roadsides being used as a store for veg genetics. Yeah. Fantastic idea. In terms of linking them and consolidating them for the sake of habitat improvement, veg genetics can easily be stored and protected in roadside vegetation, but fauna genetics gets smeared across Duco.
Yeah.
So not necessarily an ideal recommendation for the sake of the fauna component of that ecology.
Yeah.
So very specific, very fine, minute scale.
I'm sure with funding, and after hearing Pia's presentation, which is the next one, Paul's going to go back and say, we might need to do a little bit more fine-scale fauna survey.
Yeah, we've got reasonable data on the fauna. There's not much.
Talk to wires, they'll give you the numbers.
Yeah, it's just putting the stuff
I don't think
together.
it needs more maths. I just think it needs a consideration of a finer scale rather than the scope that you're looking at.
Thanks, David. Andrew, you had a question?
Yeah. With the roadside veg, presumably they're the responsibility of councils and the road authority.
Yep.
How have they have you discussed your findings with them, and how are they responding?
Yeah.
If you have.
We're planning a strategic intervention, it might be said. To summarise, yeah, there's VEAC roads managing the major roads. It's all public land. That's the first thing that you said. So it's all pretty well all public land. Some of it's VEAC roads freehold, but which is public land. So we can make recommendations pertaining to it. But the minor roads they're called council roads, and the council's behaviour, the municipalities behave as if they own them, but they don't. They just manage them. So certainly it's a key finding from a number of perspectives, but public land we can understand. Yeah, their approach will be the primary land's been set aside for a road, and that's the purpose. But a lot of the roads don't get much use. I think we'll be kind of exploring. They're happy to move roads and duplicate roads or rebuild them. They're happy to move them for all sorts of thin economic and other purposes. So we might encourage them to move them for biodiversity purposes.
Yes. There was another question up here. Yes.
So this is a very interesting analysis of what is. Since I suppose the late 80s, there's been a lot of rethinking and a lot of on-ground work, say for instance in the land care movement about rehabilitating and looking at landscape management. Have you got any analysis of what's changed since then, how things have changed over that time since intervention has started to kick in?
It's a bit of a difficult thing to assess at statewide scale because you really need to do this sort of analysis over a number of decades. I mean, we're talking about doing it again soon in the next few years, another modelling exercise to see what's been lost and so on. There are kind of issues, modelling technology, photography improves every day, and so we kind of pegged back to the 2009, 2005 technology, so it's kind of undermines innovation there a little bit. In particular, though, the problem is the comparison 2005 and 2010 is going to tell you the last 5 years changes in a 200-year history of pretty radical change. So it's going to take a number of decades to pick up those trends. It's more an exercise, picking up those trends is more an exercise in kind of conventional science of PhD projects on particular landscape functions. There are projects around this, the landscape projects that might be familiar with looking at that and working out where the most cost-effective points to intervene are. It's not just about where it's at now, but it's about where it's going, whether it's going up, the conditions getting whatever it is you're looking at, it's getting better or getting worse, and then how much difference you can make. If it's going down like that, whether you can make it go up. So it's about there's a lot of things to be done. It's about selecting a couple of dozen places where you